thank you very much, Mr. LeDoux, Joseph LeDoux. You are an American neuroscientist, and your research is primarily focused on survival circuits, including the impact on emotions, such as fear and anxiety. And before we dive deeper, maybe in that regard, I would like to ask you how you actually came about going into neurosciences in general, and how this has developed over time.
Well, it's kind of a long story, but I grew up in a small town in Louisiana, at the south of the US. My parents were French-speaking Cajuns, and it was a very small town with not many educational opportunities. I didn't have any inclination towards science at all. I went to college to study business administration. I got a master's in marketing, and the whole time I was doing that, I wasn't particularly interested in business or marketing, but it's just what I kind of fell into when I went to college and had to choose a major. So one thing that interested me about marketing was the psychology of it, why people buy stuff, and advertising and how that works. And so I took a lot of psychology courses in the especially towards the end of my undergraduate and into my master's degree. And one of the courses I took was with a professor who was studying learning and memory in the brain. I didn't know you could, actually study the brain like that in rats and actually learn something about how the human brain works. So I started working in his laboratory and got really interested in it, and decided that's what I wanted to do. So I applied to a bunch of US universities. And the only one that accepted me was the university at Stony Brook on Long Island. This is a New York State university. And the reason they accepted me is because the fellow that I was working with in Louisiana knew somebody at Stony Brook. And so they worked out this deal where, even though I had no background at all except a few psychology courses, they would take me. And it was there that I met my mentor for graduate school, Michael Gazzaniga, who was famous at the time for his work on split brain patients. These are people in whom the two hemispheres, the connections between the two hemispheres are sectioned in an effort to control epilepsy that can't be controlled in any other way. So in the 1960s and 70s, the medications that were available were not very useful, or they were useful, but not for everyone. And they weren't helping a subset of people. And then this subset, they were candidates for this split brain surgery. It's a very radical thing. It's not something you just do lightly. It's irreversible. So when you split the brain like that, you end up with basically two brains in the head, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And the language is in the left hemisphere. So when you have a conversation with these patients, you're talking basically to their left hemisphere. Now, the right hemisphere is also alive and awake, and we know that because if you put a picture of a stimulus into the right hemisphere, you might say, well, how do you put a picture in the right hemisphere? So if the patient is staring at a dot on the screen, everything to the left of that dot goes to the patient's right hemisphere. Everything to the right of the dot goes to the left hemisphere. The eyes have to remain still for that to be true, but there were controls for that. So when you put a picture of an apple into the right hemisphere and you ask the patient, what did you see? You're talking to the left hemisphere. It says, I didn't see anything. So the right hemisphere is shown several pictures, or the patient is shown several pictures, and the left hand points to the apple. So the right hemisphere saw the apple, registered it, had some kind of perception of it, and was able to point to it and select it. So this was the kind of standard story about split brain patients that had been collected by my mentor, Michael Gazzaniga, in the 1960s at Caltech when he was a student. And so this is just explaining to you how it all works. For my dissertation, we did something a little different. In one study in particular, we put one stimulus in the left hemisphere and one in the right. In other words, one stimulus on the left side of space goes to the right hemisphere, Stimulus on the right side of space goes to the left hemisphere. So now each hemisphere sees something. And you then say, what did you see? Again, he says, well, the left hemisphere in the right visual field, the left hemisphere saw a snow scene. I'm sorry. In the right visual field, the left hemisphere saw a chicken claw. And so the right hand connected to the left hemisphere pointed to the chicken, a picture of a chicken. The left visual field going to the right hemisphere saw a snow scene, and the left hand pointed to a shovel. Okay, so now you ask the patient, why did you do that? Again, you're talking to the left hemisphere. Why did you pick those? The left hemisphere says, I saw a chicken claw, so I pointed to the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. So the left hemisphere had no idea what the right hemisphere saw. It only knew that it was observing its own behavior, the person's behavior, of pointing to a chicken and pointing to a shovel. And it put those two things together to tell a story, a narration about why he did what he did. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't a fabrication. It's just simply something he did. And we, our conclusion from this simple, very simple observation is that this is not something that just happens when the brain is split. We do this all the time. We behave, and then we generate an explanation for our behavior that makes sense in the environment in which we are acting. Or even talk. Right now I'm talking. I don't have a script. I'm just talking to you. So I'm not consciously planning what I'm saying. I am saying those things. They're coming out. I'm hearing what I'm saying, and I'm conscious of what I'm hearing. So I think, okay, everything is going okay. But if I start stumbling and I can't lose my words and can't say what I want to say, then all of a sudden I'm starting to question what's going on. Why am I talking like that? So the point is that in the human brain, there's some kind of mechanism that allows us to tell a story about ourselves so that we can make sense of the world in which we live and understand it. And the reason we have to have this storytelling thing is because we all believe we have free will. And if we are producing behaviors that we don't have charge of, that's disturbing. That violates our idea that we have free will. So I'm giving you trivial examples like pointing to something, but in complex behavior where we think we're in charge, probably we're not always in charge. We narrate that to ourselves internally, and that internal representation becomes part of our conscious experience, which is kind of a justification or a explanation or simply a narration of what we're doing and why we do it. So that's what I did my PhD on. So the weird thing is that 2 days after I joined Michael Gazzaniga's lab, he asked me to write a proposal. This is before we came up with a project. He asked me to write a short proposal. So I wrote a proposal, and he said, "Oh, that sounds pretty good. You can write a paragraph. I'd like you to revise my book." So he had written a book called The Integrated Mind about his patients in the 1960s at Caltech. And it was time to update it, and he wanted me to do the updating. This is like, 2 days into being out of marketing and so forth, and into psychology, and he's asked me to revise his book. I mean, that's crazy. I have no background, no experience. He said, "You'll learn it. We'll see the patients and you'll learn what's going on." He just had confidence in me because I could write something. And so as my dissertation time basically was spent writing that book. In the process, though, we decided that we didn't want to revise his book because we had all these new ideas about narrations and consciousness and so forth that he didn't have back then. So we decided to give it a different name. In this case, it was called The Integrated Mind. His book was called The Bisected Brain, but our book was called The Integrated Mind because it was about how in normal people with the hemispheres connected, we have We have even in back up, even in normal people with the hemispheres connected, we have this ability to tell these stories about ourselves, and we thought that that was sufficiently different from what he had done in his other book to make this a different book. So 4 years after graduating with a degree in marketing, with a master's degree in marketing, and a PhD from studying consciousness in split brain patients. It's just weird how life takes you on a path, and you don't really know where you're going on that path, but sometimes it works out and sometimes it didn't. In my case, it worked out okay.
Okay, that's yeah. Okay, very, very interesting. That's very interesting. What I've learned about that from you. And so, would you say, because I read an article where you describe also in an experiment how a person thinks with their left side of their brain and the right side of the brain, and it's kind of said that it's there are different personalities from both sides. Is that like a true thing that like it depends on like what personality it is and on what side of the brain?
So we had this one patient that we did a lot of our work on, who was different from almost all of the other patients because he had the ability to read in both hemispheres, could only talk with the left. So this was the first opportunity to ask the right hemisphere what it knows about itself in the world. Because if you don't have language, you're limited to showing pictures and getting a nonverbal response. So you don't know if a right hemisphere like that has no language, is it a real human? And is there a real human in there with a sense of, social understanding, a sense of self, ideas about their future life and so forth. But in this patient, we could put letters, words into the right hemisphere, and the patient could respond, not by talking, because it couldn't talk, but by arranging letters on little chips from the game of Scrabble. I don't know if you know that game. It's just a bunch of little chips with letters, and the game is to arrange those into words and so forth. Well, the right hemisphere was able to, when we put into the left visual field, sending the information to the right hemisphere, who are you? The left hand reaches down and spells Paul with the letters. His name was Paul. So the right hemisphere and the left both knew who he was. They had the same name. But in another question, when we asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? The right hemisphere spelled race car driver, and the left hemisphere spelled draftsman, architect. Mm-hmm. So here we have some evidence that the two sides are not, even though they both have had the same life experiences, one of them wants to be an architect and the other a race car driver. Now, we can't make too much of that because it's one patient, one test of that idea by him showing pulling out those letters. But it was the first evidence that there could be two separate kinds of mental processes going on, one in each hemisphere. This is not something that would necessarily have happened typically. And of course, in addition, we asked him things about who he liked and didn't like. And so he had a social sense, he had a sense of personal self, and he had an idea about his future in the right hemisphere. So to us, that meant there are two humans living side by side in this particular boy's body, in his brain.
Okay.
But that didn't necessarily mean that every split brain patient had that, because you just couldn't answer the question or couldn't ask the question without language over there. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that language, is so important to human experience that we depend so much on language. So having language in the right hemisphere gives it a kind of boost or a bump up in terms of its cognitive ability that another patient without language couldn't have.
Okay, so that's very, very interesting. So it's basically something that because you said it was for this case, for that example of that person. Would you know where that comes from? Like generally speaking, like that there are different personalities in different sides of the brain, like that this is something that like the humans have inherently, that they have different personality traits and parts that kind of develop over time.
Well, that whole left brain, right thing was kind of a bit of pop psychology that got exploded in the culture, and much too much was made about it. That some people are left brain, some people are right brain. I think that's not appropriate. What is true is that we most people have language in the left hemisphere, but we now know there is also some kind of language capacities in the right hemisphere, in some people at least. Um, and in general, the right hemisphere is more sophisticated with spatial capacities, but it doesn't mean that the left hemisphere has absolutely no spatial capacities. So the idea that and the other point is that even if we allow that the right hemisphere is more spatial and the left hemisphere is more linguistic, that doesn't mean that everything about the two hemispheres is different. It means those two things are different. So, and when the brain is connected, the two hemispheres interact quite a bit. So you don't have this dissociation of, one hemisphere is learning something independent of what the other hemisphere is learning, because the information is shared simultaneously between the two hemispheres all the time.
Okay, so that's basically how it develops. But is it because it was only one example of one man? Do you know if that's like if there's a difference also in age, for example, when people are younger, older, or male, female, for example? Is there a difference, or is it not something that has to do with like how the brain generally works and how we actually like make up maybe our minds?
So, in split brain patients, they often have had the ones that I was had access to and studied tended to be teenage boys, and they had epilepsy from a very early age, perhaps through some kind of birth trauma, forceps removal, or something happened that injured their brain, or it could have just been a genetic problem at birth. But something happened that injured their brain so that there was epilepsy in one part of it. And when that happens, that causes things in the two hemispheres to rearrange so that the brain can kind of homeostatically adjust itself to what it has that it's capable of. So these patients are not just, quote, typical people that all of a sudden you split the brain and ask, is this what's always going on in everyone? Because their brain has, we know that brain damage in early life rewires the brain in many ways. It causes a readjustment of what does what. So it's not, we have to be a little cautious in generalizing too much. It's better to take the individual patients as interesting examples of something to think about the human brain, I think, rather than to say this is how we all are.
Okay. That makes sense. But also looking at the complexity of the brain, because I think because you would be you have such a reputation in the field, maybe you can also maybe tell or give an insight to the listeners how how complex maybe the brain is relative to maybe other things in life, because we also talk a lot about like artificial intelligence and like neural nets right now, but the brain itself is, I think, much more complex and has so many different, like the complexity I think I heard once was like the brain is as complex as the universe that we live in. Is that true? Is that something that is actually factual, or?
I don't know. What I would say though is that there's a lot of talk now, ChatGPT and all that, about AI and consciousness. That if you could identify what every neuron in the human brain does, then you could sort of reprogram that into an artificial machine. But I don't think that's going to be possible because it's not just about taking the current state of the human brain and remapping that into electronics. It's about, the human brain has an evolutionary history, or every animal brain that's alive today has an evolutionary history that goes back 3.7 billion years ago to the first life form, which is, a kind of bacterial-like cell that had to stay alive long enough to divide. Otherwise, there would have never been another bacterial cell, and the rest of the history of life would never have occurred. So, what happens in that 3.7 billion years is a lot of biological accidents. About some things didn't work, some things worked, and the things that worked got re-encoded into the organisms that were doing it, and it became a genetic it's not in any individual, but in the organisms themselves. The population of animals that survive have some trait that could have been a biological accident, but it works, so it's kept, and that becomes inserted into the progeny and the progeny and the progeny. And there are billions of these accidents that created the line that led up to the human brain, the line that led to the octopus brain, the line that led to every kind of brain. So you would have to, my opinion is, you would have to be able to reproduce not just the current state of the brain, but that entire history of biological accidents and changes that made the neurons work the way they do. Because, a neuron is not itself a single thing. I mean, it's kind of like take a country. The neuron is a country with lots of stuff in it. It's got all kinds of biological mechanisms, molecules, genes and molecules that are constantly working to allow us to function properly as a biological system that can metabolically generate energy in the way that's needed. And every neuron has the capacity to generate energy, but they do it in different ways depending on what the other constraints on that neuron are. So each neuron is an entity in and of itself, but it's not a single thing. It's got a lot of biology in it that makes it a particular entity. So even in the brain, two cells next to each other are not identical. Two neurons next to each other have their own kind of, they each have their own developmental process by which they were connected to other neurons. So it's not a simple thing to just say, okay, we're going to take what, these 10 billion neurons or however many it is in the human brain, we're going to take all those billions of neurons and put them in the right spot and connect them together. But it's not just the connectivity, it's all that deep stuff inside the neuron, the biology inside the neuron, that is so important as well. And that is reflecting that whole evolutionary history.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's very, it is very complex subject, but I would like to ask you a question about what do you think, how is, or where is this going in terms of insights about the brain? Like how well do we understand it at the moment, or does science understand it? And is it like a process, like a still ongoing process, or will it take a lot of more years to really completely understand it? Where are we at this point? I would say in general science, or scientific community that researches it, I would say.
Well, I think the beginning of research on the brain in a serious way depended on the development of the field of physiology and the development of the field of neuroanatomy. So in the 19th century, those were coming together as significant scientific enterprises, and so what we know today compared to the beginning of that in the 19th century is a lot. But do we know everything? No, and I think, and if we live long enough as a species to live another century, another millennium, we'll always be trying to understand more and more because, the brain is not a static thing. It is evolving as we speak. And so as humans, let's just say the human body is not static, it is evolving. And if we were able to take a picture of where we would be 1,000 years from now, I don't think our species has much time to go. We're like so messed up right now. But if we made it another 1,000 years, we would probably look considerably different in some ways, and well, we know that exercise is very good for the brain. Diet is pretty good too. I mean, some people. My father was at a meat market, and he ate steak every day of his life, and he died at the age of 92. So, I mean, he was a meat eater and he lived, but that doesn't mean that eating meat is necessarily good for you. Some people just have the right genes or right makeup to where their body can digest and consume that kind of thing. Others don't. So we're all each individually different. But in general, of course, I think exercise and diet are useful things.
Do you believe that for the United States, is that something that is like that there's also awareness enough for that there's like a relation between a healthy diet and also how well is the brain working, but also how are people like as they go about life, because life is so challenging during work and everything that they have to take care of their own brain in the end, that it like still functions as they go through life.
Well, we all know that it's a good idea to eat healthy and exercise, but it's very hard to do for some people. I find it hard to do, and I know that I should do it. So it's complicated. Knowledge is not necessarily always power. You can know that you should do something, but actually making yourself do it is harder.
Okay, and that is something that because I'm not sure whether that's something that has already like arrived a lot in the like broader society about how they see that, and like how they also like comment on that, on like, okay, does it actually affect me in my physics and in my abilities, or is it something that also is going through society as a whole, that people are in general maybe working or acting as like others, and they say, okay, the others are not doing that and the others are not improving much more, so why should I do it? So it's basically also a group thing that the people just act as the other peers, basically.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into this, but if you take vaccines, for example, that's it's a personal social decision that certain groups don't want it, and unfortunately that impacts that impacts everyone else, because the viruses will spread more quickly. But it's not my field. I don't want to go down that road.
Mm-hmm. But do you believe that the population in the United States is more susceptible to these issues than in Canada, for example? Because because you are originally like your family is from Canada, I think. That's what I read. So do you think that there's like maybe also a difference in the population?
I'm not from Canada, but the people that I come from, Cajuns, were originally from Canada. I don't know enough about Germany or Canada to say that they're better or worse than we are. Probably better, but that we have a lot of political problems in this country that again, I don't want to go into politics, but we do have the problem of so-called false beliefs and false knowledge that spread quite easily. I assume that there's a lot of that in Germany too.
Mm-hmm. And that is because you believe that, because that is something that I wrote down actually for the preparation of this podcast, because it is something that is not only unique to one country that we see now, often arise in the societies of people being skeptical of scientific evidence, as you said about the vaccines, for example, as you said about or brain functions, for example, and how vaccines can affect this or not affect this, for example. So as we live in a society where actually we have a lot knowledge, how is it possible that so many people are skeptic of scientific output? Do you know why that's the case?
Yeah, so I think I have an idea, and it goes back to the split brain observation of we see ourselves doing something and we narrate it. But narration is not just about seeing what you do, it's about seeing and hearing what others do. And when you live in a social group or subgroup, subculture, you're more likely to believe that what's being said amongst you than outside of you. So you have this narration about, I trust my people, but I don't trust the people outside of my group. So that narration allows that to become the reality of people in each group. So fear is a very strong motivator of social groupings. I'm not a sociologist, I'm just saying that off the top of my head, but I think it's true that fear and anxiety will cause people to hang together. You would think, well, it's also about being happy together, but that's true. But if you're being threatened, that's somehow more important than whether you're going to be happy. In other words, you stick together more likely on the basis of protecting yourselves than necessarily simply being happy together.
Mm. And this also maybe has something to do with how does it have could it have to do something with how brains develop then over time, as they as for example me as a person, when I see a lot of information which is very bad and very terrible, like the outbreak of the coronavirus or the war in Ukraine, for example, this does something to me mentally and to my brain, how I see like everything is going bad at the moment and very terrible, and so I will also feel nervous and anxious in my daily life. So is it like, so maybe it has something to do with like the information overflow on the one side, and then also the fact that people are always connected to it and always have access to it, and therefore they are always in a constant state of fear and not being sure what is going to happen, and more, even though the environment itself is safer in their home or where they live, they feel that the world itself is at chaos. But isn't actually the opposite true though? Because our lives are much safer today than 100 years ago, for example.
So, every generation tends to think that it's the most anxious because anxiety is a human condition. This was, Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, said anxiety is the price we pay for being able to choose in life. And another way to say it is anxiety is the price we pay for having a brain that can anticipate the future. So if we can anticipate the future, we can worry about it. And without anticipation, there would be no worry or anxiety. So if you imagine serfs living outside a castle in medieval times, their lives must have been awful, very poor conditions. The king and his friends are all living in the warmth inside the castle, and the serfs are living on the outside. And it had to be a miserable life, I would think. And so they probably worried quite a bit about what was going to happen to them and their children, and how they were going to survive under those conditions. So anxiety is just a feature of the human brain, I think. And sometimes, however, it gets a little out of control. And then and when it is a problem that prevents you from doing what you normally need to do in your life role or life roles, then you have an anxiety disorder. So, what you're asking, though, is about whether the digital age has complicated things even beyond what we had thought. Well, you could say the Industrial Revolution complicated things over the Agricultural Revolution, and the Digital Revolution is complicating things over the Industrial Revolution. So it's always, changing and usually moving in a more complicated direction, because the more technology or the more advanced, the more things we have that are advancing, it adds good things, but it also usually brings some bad things with it.
Mhm.
So, but I agree the digital situation has escalated things in an incremental way that is beyond anything that has ever happened before, because it's also fast. There's no time to adapt. Information is always available. People can spread information. There's no quality check on the information that's spread. So things just go out into the world. Some people begin to believe it, depending on the source. Other people don't believe it. They believe there are other things. And so it is a very complicated and messy problem.
It is complicated times. Now, towards the end, I would like to ask you just a question about the current situation in the US, if it's okay, and if you just maybe want to give your comments on that, because there is the next presidential elections coming up next year in the United States. Do you believe that this will also be something that is going to be, that there's going to be a turmoil in the society again? Towards or that the campaign itself will be very drastical because of Mr. Trump being maybe the next candidate for the Republicans?
Yeah. No, I mean, personally, there's a lot of concern about this, because we know, what goes on when certain people don't get their way.
Mhm.
And that's all.
Okay, so you don't believe that, or your personal opinion, maybe, like who will be the next United States president, if you would guess?
I have no idea. I mean, the polls right now show it's pretty close. So we'll just have to see.
Mhm. Okay. Yes. So it is a complicated topic, but towards the end, I would have one last question. So about just to come back to the brain and also specifics of the brain development, and also like how we see it nowadays today. Do you believe that we are maybe capable within the next 5 to 10 years, maybe through the help of artificial intelligence, to completely solve basic uncertainties and also maybe unknowns?
Well, I think artificial intelligence, this is not my field, so I can't, say anything with definitive confidence. But artificial intelligence is a very powerful tool, and that's why it scares the bejesus out of a lot of people, because it's so powerful, and it's getting more and more powerful. But it does have I think it has the potential for being very, help us solve some problems that are difficult for us to solve right now. I mean, the calculation ability is pretty good. And I think, in terms of moral decisions, we certainly need to leave that to the human brain rather than to artificial intelligence, because morality is a complicated topic, again, that goes back a long time. And I don't know that, and there's often a judgment call. I don't think AI can make judgment calls of that type.
In the
Or I don't think it should be allowed to do that.
Yeah, but in that regard will be difficult. And just because now this is something that came up to my mind. Just a very last question. There is this one researcher, or he's also a Google development executive, who said that by 2045 it is possible that we will reach artificial general intelligence due to the development of artificial intelligence. Do you think that is likely or a possible scenario?
Again, it's not my field. I don't know enough about it to really say anything that should be said.
Okay, but given the progress right now, whether it is likely or not.
Progress is progress, and we'll see where it is in that time.
Okay, perfect. Then thank you very much, Mr. LeDoux, for this interview. It was very interesting. And if you would like to give a last note or a last advice to the listeners of this podcast, you might do so now if you like to.
No, I think we're okay with what we said. You asked a lot of interesting questions, and thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you very much, and hopefully talk to you soon.